Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday hosted by the Cal State Bakersfield Small Business Development Center. Kelly Bearden, I'm your director of the SBDC here in downtown Bakersfield, where we are live today on September 17, 2025 for Webinar Wednesday number 359. Going to be talking about a great issue that's happening and a phenomenon that's going on around, and that's businesses for sale, people buying businesses. We'll bring in our special guest, Michael Balstad, in just a little bit. And we are here on September 17th, and this is what's up today. So we're calling all buyers and sellers. If you're looking to buy or sell your particular business, you're at the right place. I have a great belief that it's a great way to go into business is to buy an existing business. I don't think there's ever been an opportunity to where we have as many sellers looking to turn over and get out of the market and retire or move on to other ventures or whatever. So we'll go all through that today with our special guest and calling all buyers and sellers. We also are going to talk a little bit about our capital quarter, and our capital quarter will be on topic as we try to make it each week. And on topic, we mean looking at funding or acquiring businesses. So what are some of the unique funding opportunities for acquiring a business? Our regular weekly column also is our economic corner. So in addition to capital quarter, economic corner, generally on about every week. And today we're just going to briefly look at the tax rate cut. And there was a tax rate cut this morning, 0.25%. We'll look at that and talk briefly about that today. Well, we'll pull in some other news and information. Maureen will have resources that help your business thrive. Also, today, if you have questions or have answers, you have questions, we have answers. So if you would, go to the Q&A box, the question box, and click and put your questions in there. We'll circle back to those questions at the end of Michael Balstad's presentation. If they end up in the chat, we'll end up in the chat too. So don't worry about it. We'll find your questions in today's chat. As I mentioned, our producer, Maureen Busher-Dang, will be actually running the chat box and putting the resources in there so you could grab them at this moment. And a little slight change, no poll today. Too much content, so no poll. So I kind of showed this, and it's kind of been my favorite thing. And when I find a favorite thing, it's hard to lose, especially when you have a $100,000 bill. So rather than make a slide for our capital quarter or use the same existing slide that we've had for so many weeks, maybe this will be my new capital quarter introduction slide. The wonderful $100,000 bill that's really worth $2.5 million. So today we're going to look at on our capital quarter, some of the unique things that are out there for those that are looking to purchase or sell a business. And the first program I'm going to talk about is one I like to call the EIDL Advantage. And the EIDL Advantage came to us from the COVID economic injury disaster loans that all started in March 2020 and went to, I believe, well through 2022 and was really the largest economic injury disaster loan in the history of the SBA. And I believe they did somewhere approaching about $400 billion in this particular program. So there's a lot of COVID EIDL loans out there. So the EIDL Advantage is, it's got favorable terms, about 25 years, interest rate of 3.75%. The original term was 30 years, but we're 5 years into some of these and less in others. But so say around 25 years left before these totally mature at 3.75%. We have a lot of small businesses that are looking to sell businesses that have these loans. And those are going to need to be paid off out of proceeds or other things. And so with the EIDL Advantage that I like to call the EIDL Advantage is what we're looking to do is we're looking to match the term of the loan with an expected lifestyle or business lifestyle that's a little bit closer. So, we have a lot of borrowers right now who took out these loans in 2020 that still have 25 years left. And many of these people are not going to be in business in 25 years. And many of those are because they want to move on or retire or do something else. So this gives us an opportunity to look at the assumption of these idle loans. We have worked with some clients and have had some good success with doing those. One thing about the idle advantage, as I like to call it, is that you still need to go through an underwriting process through the SBA. So you are going to be required to actually provide information, and then SBA will determine if the loan can be assumed. So what they're going to be looking at is they're going to be looking at the basic underwriting criteria that goes into an SBA loan, an SBA 7A loan, for example. And they'll be looking at the credit score, the five factors that we talk about as far as accessing capital, oftentimes. And that'll be, kind of a rundown of our 5 3s that are briefly, it's going to be capital, which is money that you have to put into the business, your down payment. It is going to be some collateral. Many of these idle loans are for 150,000 and less, and we're not collateralized. So there isn't generally at least there hasn't been so far, a collateral requirement going into these idle loans. The 150,000 and less isn't true in all of them. There are some that are larger that go 350, 500, $1 million, and can go up to $2 million. Those will come with different terms and maybe are harder to assume because they have maybe some collateral that's tied or attached to them. But for the bulk of the idle loans, there was a large period of time to where 150,000 was kind of the mean, kind of the average amount that was going out. And it was going out with very little underwriting from SBA and very little actual collateral requirements. Now, when I say there was no collateral requirements on those, many of those did came with a very basic lien on them that actually leaned just kind of a UCC filing, Uniform Commercial Code, that is basically just a blanket cover on the assets out there. And oftentimes that will need to be addressed during the assumption process, is to look at that blanket that's out there, and probably in many cases that I've seen so far will need to be reassumed on the new terms. But what we're looking at here for the borrower, you're looking at, if you're able to assume this through the SBA process, you're looking at assuming the remaining terms of that EIDL loan, that economic injury disaster loan, to ensure long-term and low interest rate. So again, most of those, as far as term, have 25 years at 3.75%. Interest rates for an SBA loan now are going somewhere, let's just say round off around 10%. So the difference between 3.75% and 10% over a long period of time is a substantial amount of money. So the borrower can actually save a lot of money by being able to assume that, but it also therefore helps the cash flow and helps the cash flow for the new buyer coming in. It is a lot better than what they would have had to pay with a regular SBA loan at 10%. So assumptions can be easier to obtain than new SBA funding. So being able to assume this particular loan could be easier than actually getting new SBA funding. You're not needing to go through all the required paperwork. You're still going to have an underwriting process. So SBA will just not rubber stamp every potential borrower and say, they're going to look at your credit history. They're going to look at the collateral. They're going to look at, oftentimes they look at down payment. They're not going to be looking at that one so much here. They're going to be looking at the condition of the business and what the borrower can bring to the table and how it is going to look afterwards. So those are all things that they'll look at during that underwriting and scrutiny process. So for the seller, the idle advantage, the economic injury disaster loan, is a win-win-win, and that can provide more cushion to the transaction. So it's a win for the seller. They get to eliminate this long-term debt. It's a win for the buyer for those reasons that we just identified, and it's a win for the SBA because they now have a borrower that matches up the term of this 25-year idle loan with something more realistic with most likely a younger borrower in many cases. Now, I've been asking this question, can it actually add value? I understand the lower interest rate is difficult to quantify. It can be done. But can these extraordinary terms of a very long term period and then also a very cheap interest rate, can it actually add to the value of the selling price? I'm of the assumption that it's yes, but more on that as we get down the road. And here's how a sample transaction of that might work. We have a selling price for $350,000. You assume an idle loan that's 5 years old, has 25 years left, about $140,000. You do have $110,000 to put down into this business. And then the seller will actually, in this example, carry back funding for $100,000. So in order to make this transaction go, all you need is the seller willing to finance $100,000. In this one, a buyer willing to have a down payment, and then also the SBA willing to do the assumption on the idle loan, and that idle loan with the new terms comes into play. So depending on what your seller terms are, you could have separate terms for seller financing, but by averaging those out and using our wonderful average weighted cost of capital, you could be in at a very low interest rate. And also we've done this example in the past to where you can actually purchase a business with no money down. And there's your selling price. In this example, we're assuming that idle, but also we're getting an SBA loan for 110 because the owner doesn't have anything to put down. And also the seller is willing to finance this at $100,000. This is in the standard operating procedures for SBA loans. It is more difficult to do these days, and everything else has to be spot on. So that you are going to probably need some collateral on that SBA loan portion of 110,000. The projections of you moving into this business need to be rock solid. Your credit needs to be rock solid. The condition of the business and the industry need to be solid. And then the owner, for their $100,000, needs to wait until you have paid off the $110,000 to SBA before that loan is amortized. So you do need, you could receive interest-only payments during the time that the SBA loan is going, but really the SBA requires that that loan be paid off. In our economic corner, moving right along, the federal cut the interest rate today by 0.25%, mentioning also that 2 more cuts are likely. Weaknesses in the labor market cited as the main example. And also uncertainty-related inflation and other economic concerns to lower the price on those. Affects most lending rates that are variable from SBA loans, many SBA loans to credit cards and others. Coming up is our CSU Bakersfield NextTech Kern, a full-day event on campus on October 2nd that is going to have a lot of different tracks for AI. It's going to have one in academia, one in business, one in security. A lot of our companies that are dealing in AI will be there. A lot of information. You can go sign up. I know I've signed up. You can see me there. I'll be there. And we'll have much more on this as we come up. Also, our small business credit survey is open. Our small business credit survey is an opportunity for you to participate in a 12-minute survey. We love it when you participate, and we thank you in advance for doing so. This survey is open until November 14th, so we got plenty of time to get 100 of you to actually go through this process, and then that would allow us to get our own partner report that we got in 2024 from the Fed. And a lot of these slides that you see provided by the Federal Reserve Bank, thank you. It's great having a partnership with you and being able to promote your survey to our audience and our SBDC clients. So with this, we get a lot of data and a lot of information. So it is fantastic that it's out there. Also, a quick toot of the horn to our local small business. Haley Moore, owner of 10 More Books here in Bakersfield, who was featured at our national conference in Florida early this month. This slide kind of got a little out of control, but it was supposed to go beforehand. But anyway, this is kind of an example of what we get, the information that we get. Very valuable information for us if you participate in the survey. And what you see is you see that this one is just ask you the number of employees that you have. And then we get back that data, which shows that we have some more larger firms, but still pretty close and consistent with the kind of the old bellwether 1 to 4 employees. So that is valuable information to us. And if you want some more invaluable information, we have a toolbox just full of great resources for you. We have our live plan planning software and Vertical IQ. We'll talk about Vertical IQ and the market analysis that you can get from that particular program that really helps you in analyzing if this business is right for you to purchase. But a lot of the other information that's in here, we can talk about it another time. Thanks again to our great sponsors, the County of Kern SBA, Cal OSBA, and also the Blue Tech Valley, St. Cal College Business and Public Administration. Thank you all so much. There are a lot of ways to digest Webinar Wednesday. You're live here today, or maybe are you? You could be on the on-demand version right now on the copy, but you can actually watch it live from 12 to 1 Pacific time every Wednesday. You can register for that, and if you cannot attend, you will get a link by email, and you will get an email with that particular link, all the resources and other great information, or subscribe at our CSUB SBDC YouTube channel. And you can always contact us for confidential, no cost, no obligation at all, expert consultation. Sign up at our website, csubsbdc.com. Also, the wonderful human resource hotline is available. There's a list of numbers that you can contact them if you have any questions on buying a business, on exactly what happens, what you need to know about maybe employees that you're inheriting in that business. So there's your phone number, call by county. And now it's time to bring in our special guest for today. And our special guest today is Michael Balstad. He's the founder of BizLeavable, a firm specializing in exit strategies for owners wanting to sell, transition to be past being a business owner. Mr. Balstad, a certified exit planner, discusses the options available, smoother transaction to the next phase of your life. Balstad has worked with several and dozens and hundreds of business owners wanting to move on, providing options for those particular owners. He has mentioned 80% of businesses for sale do not end in a positive transaction, and we want to change that. We want to change it to a much higher percentage, which is why we're offering this program today. He has suggestions to get us to that point. Many businesses, great opportunities for those wanting to start or buy. So let's bring in Michael Balstad. Michael, it is great to have you back on Webinar Wednesday. Thank you for joining us, and please do take it away.
Excellent. Great to see you again, Kelly, and everyone else who's here. And let me go ahead and pull up today's presentation. So I was asked to do something that would appeal to both buyers and sellers today. And basically what we're looking at here is, it's for those of you who are buyers, you kind of get to see a fly on the wall on what an owner is going to have to address in order to make a business attractive for you to acquire. And for sellers, you're going to become pretty clear on what's going to be necessary to be in place for a potential buyer to want to make you one of the fortunate 1 in 5 that ever do sell. Now, again, I would love nothing more than for those statistics to change. And the only way that those statistics can change is for more of these presentations and more folks to give these presentations that I've been giving, so that folks can get some insights on what drives business value. So we're doing a countdown today. It's 6 steps, 5 stages, 4 C's, and a 3-legged stool. There's a 2 and a 1 also, but I didn't want to take up the whole slide. Okay, so there are 6 steps to selling your business. And for most of you, you've either bought or sold a home or rented out or rented a home. And on either side of that transaction, there were a number of things that had to happen in order from the keys to pass from one person's hands to the other. So for those of you who are wanting to sell your business, I want you to think about if you ever sold a home, you met with your agent, they probably gave you some comparable sales statistics from around your neighborhood. And it showed you maybe roughly, this is the typical size home, this is the price per square foot, because that's typically the metric that valued a home. Okay, if a house valued at $300 a square foot, if that's the average, I'm not sure what it is in California anymore. I've relocated a couple years ago, but if it's $300 a square foot, then if it's a 2,000 square foot house, that's a $600,000 house, right? So that's typically the metric that residential homes go by, is a price per square foot. But in order to get into those comps, what that agent is going to advise you on are things like, do you have curb appeal when someone pulls up? Like, do you have siding peeling off the side of your house? Do you have a bunch of rust all over the light fixtures on the outside of your garage door? You know, is your driveway got lots of cracks in it? You know, things that make it look unattractive. And they're going to give you guidance on, does it make sense to paint the front of your home? Does it make sense to do something like put a swimming pool in the backyard if you don't have one? Or are you better set to invest that money putting in a new kitchen and master bathroom? They're going to tell you, yeah, the pool's just going to be a big hole in the backyard that you're throwing money into, right? You're probably not going to get the return on investment you're looking for if you chose to do that. In preparing your business for sale, there are a number of things that would represent curb appeal. Now, if you've got, say, a location, and you're a location-centric business, maybe you're a restaurant, you're a dry cleaner, you have a laundromat, and if you've got a cloth awning out front, and if it's hanging off the frame and it's got tears in it, the first thing that a buyer's going to look at is they pull up and say, gosh, we look, just pulling up to it, the thing looks disheveled. If that's what it looks like on the outside, what's it going to look like on the inside? That's what's going to come to mind. It's that first impression. And it's really hard to overcome that. So addressing some of the curb appeal issues is going to be really important. Another thing to consider is if you have a lot of old inventory. Let's say that you're in a clothing business. And I actually had a client who was looking at buying one of their wholesale suppliers. They weren't in clothing, they were in another good, but let's say that you're in clothing and you've got a bunch of excess inventory that was in style 5 years ago, and you bought too much of it, and it never sold. It never sold while it was in style, but you've still got it not only on your books in your inventory, but you also have it physically in your warehouse or wherever your storage is. Now, remember that when someone's looking to buy a business, what they're wanting to buy is transferable value. They're wanting to buy an established business with cash flow. They're wanting to buy the benefit of your experience over the years, right? So if they're looking at your warehouse and say, well, gosh, these people really didn't even know how to buy inventory. They bought so much that never sold and it's still sitting here cluttered. Do I really want to trust their judgment? So having a lot of that excess inventory, you might be better suited to sell it for pennies on the dollar, because that cash in hand, even though it's pennies on the dollar, you're probably losing less than you would having it applied as a risk discount to your business, because someone, looks at your business and says, yeah, I don't know if I trust their skill in purchasing. It's just going to leave questions in their mind. So we want to remove those questions. Talking about this client I was working with, of the price that these folks were wanting, it was over a 50-year-old business that they were looking at acquiring. All of their invoices were still written by hand. So they hadn't done any modernization. So there's questions there about, all right, we're trusting human judgment, and people don't do that a lot anymore, right? But the other thing was several $100,000 of the price they were asking was for inventory that they had never sold. And they were trying to price that at wholesale of what they paid for it. Well, there's no way that inventory was worth anywhere near, even at retail, what they had paid wholesale for those years ago, because it was no longer current inventory. And not only that, it had been sitting in a warehouse. So that became one of the reasons that A, the price wasn't agreed upon. B, we said we're discarding that as an asset. We're not willing to acquire that asset. You can keep it and do whatever you want with it, right? There were a number of other reasons, that being one of them, that it ultimately became a business that was not acquired. There were a number of these kinds of red flags that just made it not worth the price nor the trouble to modernize it for my client. So dealing with and addressing a lot of those things up front before you ever go to market, you see things that are going to create an objection in the eyes of a buyer. It's better to address them before they ever see them, right? It's not that you're hiding them. If you hide them, it will be found out in due diligence. It's about fixing and addressing it up front so that you're not having to, like you see in real estate. Someone comes in, you decide not to paint the front of your house. So what winds up happening, the person wants to make an offer on your house when it's not a seller's market, and they say, we want a $20,000 credit to paint the house. You probably could have done it yourself for $5,000, right? On the weekend, get your own rollers and your paint, and you could have addressed it, and it would have been, you wouldn't have had to give this credit, if that makes sense. So this is what you're looking at doing with your business. So once you've done that, and maybe you're working with a business broker, for the majority of people, like we look at the statistics of, the businesses that are in, as we look at the size of businesses nationally, there's the biggest percentage probably will not work with a broker. You're probably at valuations that put you below a threshold that many brokers will work with. So in any case, it's going to be important for you to have this understanding. You're still going to need professional guidance, but whether it's talking with someone like me through SBDC, where Kelly has, we'll talk about it later, but he has secured some of my time to be available to SBDC clients to help you go through, if you're thinking about selling your business, going through and looking at some of your circumstances and seeing what makes sense to address before you go to market. So that brings us to step 2, which is marketing. Once you have a business that you've dealt with the curb appeal and getting rid of inventory that's dated, getting rid of equipment that you either don't use anymore or isn't functional anymore, that's the same thing as the other, get rid of it, get it out of sight, out of mind, put that capital that you get from it to work at something that gets you a return on investment. Now we go to marketing. Marketing is, how do you get your business that's for sale in front of a ready, willing, and able marketplace that may have an interest in acquiring that? Well, some of the first things that you're going to need to do in order to market is you're going to need to gather things that a buyer would care about. So one thing that a buyer is going to care about that's, probably the most obvious is, are you profitable? Now, digging down into that a little bit, it's really more important than the profit. It's, do you have financial record keeping that demonstrates a business that's not failing, that's not going bankrupt, that has clear and accounted for assets and liabilities, that you can document how predictable your cash flow is, right? That you've got, that your taxes are current and in order. Those are things that people are going to look, because it's like, if they know that they want to be an XYZ kind of business, they already know that. The first thing they want to know is, all right, of all those businesses that are for sale, which ones appear to be the most financially healthy? Chances are the person that's going to buy your small business is not going to be a private equity firm. It's not going to be someone who's consolidating a bunch of business. It's going to be an operator like yourself. As an operator, they may have never purchased a business before. They may not know the things to look for. But if they're having to secure SBA financing, if they're having to assume an EIDL loan as an extension of that SBA financing, the bank and or the underwriter at the SBA with regard to the economic injury disaster loan is going to want to look at that financial record keeping. They want to make sure that on the business side, it's a risk that they're willing to put money behind. Does the bank feel that the business has a likelihood of being able to repay that loan? The folks ruling on whether or not you're going to be able to assume that loan, one of the pieces they're going to look at is the buyer. One of the pieces that they're probably going to look at is, do they think the business would survive that transition? Of course, every case is individual. Everybody's, it's what officer are you working with at a bank? What officer are you working with at the SBA? But they do have guidelines they have to go by. One of those has to do with the amount of cash flow that's there to service the available debt. So it's really critical in the preparing that you're gathering all of your financial documentation and you're making sure that if it's not current, if it's not complete, that you're working with someone to make it so. That then, when we go to marketing, goes into the data that's going to be available. Now, all of that data, sellers, you're not giving all that information up front. That information will not be provided. In-depth information will not be provided to anyone until they have given you some type of an offer in writing and signed a non-disclosure. At this point in time, what's going to happen is you're going to write a listing. The marketing is going to involve you coming up with a confidential memorandum, a price that's being asked for the business, a high-level, general, anonymous when possible description of your business, i.e., business for sale is a 50-year-old hardware store in Central California. Nothing that's identifiable, because the last thing you want is your competitors knowing that you're for sale, right? I mean, they're going to could take advantage of that. So it's going to talk about the price. The listing is probably going to mention what the cash flow is, because most people buying the business want to have an idea of what they can expect to make. What's their return on investment? What cash flow can they expect to be getting out of the business? So usually those listings will have gross sales, cash flow, and a description of the business. Where are those found? There are sites like bizbuysell.com, BizBen. If it's a franchise, there's one called FranchiseGator. There are a number of these websites that are marketplaces for businesses for sale, much like real estate agents use MLS for listing homes for sale. Or you look at, LoopNet is a marketplace where brokers list and manage commercial real estate. So BizBuySell is where owners as well as business brokers will list businesses that are for sale. So now once you've marketed that and you've gotten your business listing in front of an audience and someone has said, hey, I'm really interested in your business, you're going to ask them for a non-disclosure agreement. They're going to be able to see some due diligence, and that's going to allow them to decide, hey, I'm willing to pay that price, or I'm willing to make an offer for the business that is not exactly as you have positioned it from a price standpoint or a terms standpoint. You might say, I'm willing, as a buyer, you might say, I'm willing to give you your price, but I don't have any down payment and I want seller financing, right? So there's a number of terms that are going to have to be negotiated. That's why I say negotiate all deal points. So it can be price. It can be how financing is going to be handled. It can be how much time the buyer would like the seller to remain to help them transition successfully into the business. Some buyers may not care. They may have tons of experience in that space. They may be from the local community. But some folks, maybe they have experience in that line of work, but they're from somewhere else completely, and they don't have relationships left or yet in the community. A buyer buying that business is buying the heavy lifting that you already did. You created a reputation, you created a brand, you've done the things that have allowed you to have a successful, sustainable business that this person now wants to acquire because it is less risk than them starting from scratch. So, of course, if they're going to buy that business, they're going to want some help from the seller to help ensure that that value does transition to the buyer, if that makes sense. So there are a number of terms that are going to be negotiated. So at this point, we've gone through half of those 6 steps. Are there any questions at this point, Kelly or Maureen?
Michael, there are a few questions if you want to take them right now. Or
I'm glad, and I should have said that in housekeeping. It's meant to be conversational. So as long as they're on the topic we're on, I'm glad to take them as we go.
Most of the questions so far have to deal with the tax consequences.
Okay, we'll get into some of that later. And honestly, that's one disclosure I have to give. I'm not a CPA. Consequently, the only tax advice I can give you is that you absolutely are going to need to get tax advice prior to entering into any kind of sale transaction. But we'll get into more of that later. Are there any non-tax?
Yeah, let me give you one right here. What is a typical time frame for a sale of a business?
So I tell people to expect 9 months. Because typically when I meet with someone, their business isn't ready for sale. There are things that we're doing to help get that business more prepared. The other thing I tell people is that I would expect no better than 90 days for an SBA loan. And if someone's working with me, I'm typically also connecting them with other SBA resources where we're able to streamline not the loan itself, but the process. One of the biggest things that happens with SBA loans is that folks aren't prepared. And maybe they're going to the wrong bank because different banks have different appetites. Some will like it into, like one bank may not like dry cleaners. Well, if you went and applied at that bank, you might get 15 to 30 days down the road before an underwriter saw it and said, wait, we don't lend to dry cleaners. And you might then have to go start over at another bank. So if you're working with someone who's experienced in this, they're going to help to make sure that first and foremost, you're only applying at banks that are relevant to your industry, your size, and your credit risk. But even with that, there's a lot of moving parts. And I feel like if we under promise and over deliver and or manage expectations and put it on the long end, I say 9 months. I've heard people say as long as 12 months. Some of it, again, has to do with the banking. Some of it has to do with the amount of money that somebody has to put down. Some of it has to do with cleaning up books or wanting to justify a value. So we need to say right now isn't the right time to sell because of economic factors, if that makes sense. For instance, we look at the 3 3/4% loan rate that Kelly mentioned on an economic injury disaster loan. We look at right now what you're going to, and I have one case right now where someone's looking at paying 10 3/4% interest on an SBA loan for a $500,000 acquisition. Now, compared to 2 years ago, that loan payment, just like if you would have bought a house 3 years ago versus buying it now, I know when we left California we're looking at the same loan balance. Our loan balance here was the same as our loan balance in California on an older rate. Our payment was double just because of the increase in interest when interest rates started going up. Nothing was changed. Credit score wasn't worse. Loan balance wasn't higher. It's just the higher the interest rate, the lower the affordability. The higher the interest rate, the less expensive a house you can afford. The same goes with business, only the way that the bank looks at it is they're looking at how much free cash flow is the business generating. Well, if the business is generating the same amount of cash flow now as it was 3 years ago, the bank's not going to be willing to finance the same amount because the payments are higher, if that makes sense. So sometimes the more extended period of time to sell the business has to do purely with economic factors. So I would say, allow in your timeline the expectation that you're probably looking at 9 or more months. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next, which is final due diligence. Think about this as when you're selling your house, somebody's written you an offer. And on that offer, what happens? They're not in the heyday when it was a seller's market and people were making all cash, over asking, no inspections, all of that stuff. In more normal circumstances, what typically happens is someone makes an offer, and that offer is pending all things being as you represented them. Now, it doesn't mean that you're hiding things. What it does mean is when an inspection is done, they may find things you weren't aware of. They may find, for instance, that there are some foundation issues that have to be addressed, right? Well, a buyer's going to say, well, hey, wait a minute, that's more than I want to bite off, right? I don't want to have to buy this house and then fix the foundation. Or if they do, they're going to want a credit or a significant discount. Why? Because that risk of that foundation and the cost of repairing it decreases the value of the house overall, right? Because their expectation is they're buying a home that's ready for them to move in, or it's a home that's ready to move in minus the things that they're already aware of. And they agreed upon a price and made an offer based on that. The inspection may uncover other things that would give them the right to address their original offer. And in real estate, typically in California, you're looking at 17 days. 17 days is baked into that. You've got 17 days to get inspections and walk away from that deal for any reason, unless things have changed since I've been there, because I'm not a real estate agent in California. But I know that was our experience. So the same goes here. Now, the 17 days isn't a thing. That's not the same thing. But the due diligence is where a buyer is going to have a right and an expectation to do a very extensive physical on your business. They're going to want to see your financials, your taxes. They're going to want to understand if there are any current or potential legal issues that you're facing. They're going to want to have a clear understanding of any leases you have and their transferability. They're going to want to understand what assets you have on your balance sheet and any assets that you're not including in the sale, if there's anything like that. They're going to want to understand any potential regulatory risks or changes. So for instance, if you're selling a smoke or vape shop, there may be regulatory changes coming that would have nothing to do with your ability to operate the business, but they may affect the ability for that business to operate legally in the future, right? So that final due diligence, they're going to be looking at all of those things, all the internal and external items that would affect the viability of that business and its ability to perform once they've acquired it. Now, buyers, the sellers are going to want to do some due diligence as well. They're going to want to understand if, what is your track record? Do you have any experience in the industry? Do you have experience in management or entrepreneurism at all? Do you have any relevant experience that could be easily segued into running this business? That's the first piece. Next, they're going to want to, as will the lender, want to look at your credit and your how you handle yourself and your reputation. Do you pay your bills? Do you honor your obligations? Those types of things. And that is going to help the seller understand if you're the right buyer. They're going to want to understand your motivations. If that seller is a local business and they may have, they have no control over what you do once you buy the business. But if they know right off the bat that there are changes that you want to make or ways that you want to run your business that are different than the legacy that they want to leave, they may not evaluate you as favorably. So they've got a number of things that they're going to look at too, as will their proxies, which would be their lenders and their attorneys and such. Now, once due diligence is done, everybody's come together, they love one another, they've agreed to the terms, they've agreed to how everything's going to go, then we go to legal documents. And that's where we're going to have the contract, the accepted contract of sale. We're going to have all of the exhibits, which are going to include all the contracts, all of the, any exhibits that were used for considering that business. So that would be all the things that you looked at in due diligence, all of the supporting documentation and everything. So anything related to affecting that transaction is going to be included in that. Those documents will be assembled. The business goes into escrow. All of those documents are executed by the relevant parties. And at that point in time, once funding is wired from the buyer and or their lender to the seller, at that point, you're closing escrow and you move into the final step, which is a transfer of ownership. Now, during the period that you're working through the transactions, how it's going to work, you're also looking at a timeline. Again, I already mentioned that oftentimes a buyer is going to want to keep the seller around for some period of time. It could be a week, it could be 6 months. If it's an SBA deal, the SBA won't allow the seller to stay around more than 1 year. So some period of time. But the other things that you have is, all of the trade accounts, the insurances, a lease, however that's going to work, if there's a location or equipment leases that have to be transferred, internet account, all of the marketing assets, customer lists, all of those things will be transferred to the new owner. You'll have meetings with the employees to introduce the new owner and transition that, because the last thing that a potential buyer wants is to show up on day one and all the employees have left, right? They're expecting that they're buying a going concern with employees in most cases. So, that's part of what you're going to help facilitate. You can't make them stay, but you're going to hopefully have made sure in advance that those employees want to stay, or at least there's a reasonable expectation of what number of employees will stay because you've had those communications. And then finally, meetings with the customers and helping to make sure that the buyer is seen in a favorable light. This is why I've chosen this individual to continue the legacy of XYZ hardware, right? So that all comes along that timeline that you guys will have mutually agreed upon. And by the way, that's part of the terms that you will have negotiated. Okay, so that's 6 steps. Now, the rest of this isn't going to take as long, but I wanted to have, both parties here, the buyer and the seller, to understand that there is a process. And he kind of blew my one rule that everybody should know, which is the final piece of the countdown, because he mentioned it at the very beginning. That 80-20 rule, which is 80% of businesses go out of business in the process of selling. And that's why they're not following a process, right? You have business brokers and M&A advisors who have a process by which they conduct transactions and make sure that those get to the finish line. If you're just out there winging it, you have no idea how to price it, prepare any of those things. And that's why, in most cases, only 1 in 5 businesses survive an attempted sale. So this is the framework for that. So at least now you understand the steps that the professionals are using. This does not make you a business broker, but at least you have an understanding of what goes into it at a very high level. Now we're looking at the 5 stages of value maturity. When you look at it and you say, well, why does this matter? If you're a business owner, if you don't understand the current value of your business, that's step 1, identify. Determine the initial value in your business in order to maximize that value. Conducting an annual business valuation will help determine what value factors to focus on to accelerate the value of your business. Now, why is this relevant if you think you want to sell right now? Well, first, if you don't know what your business is worth, how can you expect to have a price rooted in reality that someone would be willing to pay? You might say, well, Mike, you already mentioned that most of the buyers of a small business are probably first-time owners themselves. They may not really know. They just know they want to buy the business. Well, if they're using bank financing, the bank will know, right? So the valuations also have a framework. They also have a formula on how they're calculated. And I will tell you why this is so important. A survey, Mass Mutual is a large life insurance carrier, and they put out a study every couple of years on owner readiness. And one of the questions they ask is, have you had your business valued in the last 3 years? 44% indicate that yes, they have. When asked who conducted that valuation, 29% overall, or basically 2/3 of that 44%, indicate that it was themselves or their business partner. Well, if themselves or their business partner don't understand how you calculate the value of a business, then there's a very low likelihood that that will be accurate. How inaccurate, you might ask? The standard deviation, or the amount of error above or below the actual value that's typical, is 60% for someone who values their own business without using the appropriate methodology. They're just coming up with their own number. So in simple terms, that means there's a lot of people who've put their business on the market that's worth $100,000 that they've listed for $160,000, and they're probably not going to get any offers because there's such a gap. I'm sure you've seen overpriced houses on the market. It's not even worth writing an offer, right? The gap is just too big. So if you're at a point where you haven't even identified the value of a business, that's where you're going to want to put some work. Now, for those of you who are buyers and you're out looking at businesses already, there's another webinar I should do with you folks that want to buy. There's a lot of things you should be thinking about before you go to buy a business, but let's presume that you already are. This is one of the things that you got to look at, particularly if it's a business listed for sale by owner. The price that they have on there may be well-intentioned on their part. It also may not be accurate. If they're not using the right, first of all, if they're not using the right multiples, and if they're not using the right number to multiply it by. So if they're multiplying by revenue, that's very unlikely they're getting, and if they're using the wrong multiple to boot, their value could be, way, way, way off, right? So that's one thing that you'll want to be aware of as you go out to looking and buying businesses. So the second stage of value maturity is protect. To best protect your value, you must consider the 5 Ds: death, disability, divorce, distress, and disagreement. Even if you do not think you'll be affected by one of these, without preparing for the worst, your value will be negatively impacted. Put that into perspective of you wanting to sell your business right now. You're not trying to prepare for something in advance. Well, let's say that you have a business partner, and the reason that you're wanting to sell the business is because your business partner died, and you didn't have a buy-sell agreement in place. Well, that buy-sell agreement, when we talk about death, that buy-sell agreement, without that in place, basically, you guys made a decision by not making a decision. What you've decided is that in the event of one of our deaths, our new business partner will be the heirs of the partner that passed away. If you and I were partners, that would mean that my 3 kids, none of whom knows anything about business or has any desire to, would have 50% ownership in the business, the ability to have a say-so on whether or not you can sell it, the ability to go to court to sue you about it, and bring nothing to the table in order to help you continue to operate that business and fill the gaps left by your partner. Now, on top of that, if you're going to market and someone's looking at buying your business, you've put a price on the business of X, and the partners theirs don't agree to that price. There's no one in the world that's going to try to buy your business because it's going to have to be forced in court, right? So in order to protect that, in order to protect the business against those types of implications, having a buy-sell agreement in place that dictates what happens if a partner dies, if they become disabled, if they go through a divorce. How do we ensure that the company is not affected by, particularly in California, that's a community property state? How do we protect the business from having shares go to a former spouse? Now, it doesn't mean that the former spouse doesn't get value. It just means that their share of the value of that business is going to have to be paid for by that partner through other means than the business, if that makes sense. Again, not addressing those things now before you sell the business, if it's going to be some time and you have multiple owners, is going to create a problem when you go to try to sell it, because everybody may not be on the same page. Going back to identify, that is one other thing that I missed. Assuming you have a partner, being able to come up with an actual value that you both can agree on will also avoid the problem of going to market and one of you wanting one price and one of you not agreeing and blowing up the deal, right? So that's another critical reason to have the price agreed upon. While you're at it with the buy-sell agreement, another thing that I would recommend is ensuring that buy-sell agreement. Because let's face it, if the buy-sell agreement states, if I die, you agree to buy my shares of the business at a particular price, and my estate agrees to sell it to you at that particular price, that creates an obligation. Putting insurance, term insurance, very inexpensive, putting term insurance in place allows those shares to be purchased, right? So instead of having to bankrupt the business to buy the other person's estate out, the life insurance proceeds pay for it. So the protection is very important. So now once you've done that, you've dealt with 1 and 2. In 1, you've looked at value. You also looked at things to do in order to maximize value. If you're looking at your value, it's not enough to just say, oh, my business is worth $500,000. It could be that based on current market multiples and based on your cash flow, the potential value of your business is $1 million. But because of the gaps in your business, because of the risks and red flags, right now you could probably only get $750,000 for it. Stated another way, if you remodel your kitchen, you might get another $250,000 for your house. That's the kind of situation we're looking at here. If you deal with these red flags and gaps, you would be able to close that value gap in your business. And that brings us to number 3. There are 2 ways to build value: increase your cash flow and improve your multiple. So increasing your cash flow means increasing the profits left over after paying all of your bills, in most simplistic terms. There's a few different ways that measure that. EBITDA is one. But the other way is to increase the multiple. And the way you increase the multiple is you reduce operational risk. Every risk that's identified in your business is just another discount to your value. So when you've identified your value in step 1, what you've also identified is what are the discounts being attributed to my business's value, and what are the gaps creating those. In step 3, we then create and execute on an action plan to improve and close those gaps and remove those red flags. What might those be? Not having an employee handbook. Not having an employee handbook can expose you to incredible risk. Kelly mentioned HR earlier, right? Particularly in California, HR not managed well is a ticking time bomb, right? A couple visits to the labor board could just kill your business, right? So addressing those things begins to remove red flags and close gaps. Legal contracts, right? Having, confidentiality, protecting your intellectual property, having all that legal. If you've got patents and you haven't legally protected them, you haven't protected your IP or your brand, that's a risk to the person buying the business. I had one. It was brought to me. They had a brand. When they did go, they didn't right away go to protect it. They didn't go to protect it until the first time they tried to sell their business. They went and they filed a copyright, and they immediately got served a cease and desist by another established brand that tried to say that they had claim to this particular catchphrase. That then had to go to a mediation, right? And there were legal costs associated with it. You want to have that figured out before you're at the deal table and someone's agreed to buy your business and all of a sudden you're getting sued by a competitor, right? So addressing all of those things are going to help you to build value in your business, which then brings us, and what does that also do? Once you've built that and you've closed those gaps, that prepares you for what we discussed before, due diligence, right? Because when someone goes to look at due diligence, they can see there's no red flag or gaps. You've already cleaned them up, so they're not having to question it. You've already addressed all of those things. So after you've done all of that and you've built the value in your business, you might say, hey, Mike, that's all well and good. I'm not sticking around another 1 or 2 or 3 years to grow a business. I want to sell it now. Great, you can. If there are gaps and red flags, just understand that the price you may be able to get for your business is going to take all of those gaps and risks into consideration. That's just going to be a reality for you. But whenever you sell it, now or later, that brings you to a point where you're going to have a transaction. And that transaction is going to generate sales proceeds. Now, those sales proceeds are going to be reduced by whatever costs there are for the transaction. So if you've got legal, if you've got tax advising, if you've got a business broker, they charge 10% in many cases, some even more than that, for managing your transaction. It's a lot more than a real estate transaction, but it's also a lot more complicated than a real estate transaction. Then also taxes, right? So your harvest, you're going to have your harvest, and even though you've got a field of corn that looks immense, you're not keeping the stalks, right? You're not keeping any of that, so you're just keeping the seed. So the same with the harvest, you're going to wind up with net proceeds, and those net proceeds then take us to step 5, which is manage. You now had a liquidity event from which you harvested financial resources that you're going to use in some way for the next act of your life. Now, it may be for retirement, it may be to get into another business, it may be that it wasn't a huge part of your income and you're simply going to use it to do some things for your kids or remodel the house. Who knows? You can do whatever you want with it, or you can invest it for your future, right? So that's stage 5 of managing your value maturity, is managing the resources created by the liquidity of successfully growing, building, and selling that business. Before I move on to number 4, are there any questions?
I don't see any, Michael.
All right, wonderful. So we know about the identifying value and we know about protecting. Number 3 talked about build, and that's building and maximizing value. So there are 4 C's I want you to remember. These 4 C's are responsible for most of what creates value in a business. Most of the things not only that build value, but also in their absence, create a risk that discounts your business, is going to be in one of these 4 broad areas. Human capital, that is the ability to attract, retain, and motivate your team, evolve as the needs of the organization require. Or as I like to say it, having the right people in the right seats. The next is structural capital. The structural capital is the policies, procedures, systems, branding, intellectual property everything that contributes to the efficient, effective, and profitable operation of your business. Buyers, this is especially for you. If you are evaluating whether to start a business from scratch or buy an existing business, this one item right here will be the biggest determining factor of why buying versus starting makes the most sense. 9 in 10 businesses that start from scratch are out of business within 15 years. 90%, 1 out of 10 make it beyond 15 years, which means if you're acquiring a business that's 20 years old, you've found a business where that owner managed to identify their target customer, attract them, keep them, build a brand and reputation that made them staples in their niche, in their marketplace, in their community. Not only that, they've created the systems and processes, hopefully, that allowed them to take what made what they do successful. They have them as systems and processes so that those then can be taught and delegated to others. Otherwise, it's completely dependent on the owner, which is one of the biggest contributing reasons to why 4 and 5 businesses don't make it through a sale, because the business is so dependent on the owner that if they step away, the business collapses, right? There's no one there to run it because no one knows what to do because the owner keeps it all in their head, right? So that structural capital is it's the 7 herbs and spices of a famous chicken brand, right? It is the recipe that made that business successful. And to the degree that they've documented all of that, that is your blueprint to take that business over and be able to operate it into the future, if that makes sense. So typically I look at that one first. The second one is human capital, having the right people in the right seats, executing on the structural capital, because it's great to have a blueprint, but if you don't have people that can read the blueprint or refuse to read the blueprint is of no use to you, right? So the next thing is social capital. Social capital really is the environment, the health of the environment in which the human capital is executing on the structural capital. So let's say you've got this restaurant and it's a chain. And you go into this restaurant, it could be a meat and 3 like we have here in the South. It could be a Subway sandwich, it doesn't matter. But you walk into that place and in that chain, they all have the same sign. They all have the same menu. They all have the same branding. They all have the same kind of speech and how they're supposed to talk to their customers. But you may be in some locations where the person who greets you at the table says, "You want some coffee or what?" And you may be in a different one where they've got bling all over their name badge and they're saying, "Hey, you know, have you tried our new this? And you know what? We've got this new beverage." They are offering choices. They're offering, "Hey, this drink is really good with this meal," or "This dessert is really wonderful," or "Hey, I noticed that you mentioned that your child doesn't like milk. We've got this alternative," right? Those that are helpful, those that are in a culture that is healthy and where people are engaged and enjoy being there and are interacting with each other healthily, creates how they are experienced by your customer. So if we have the person saying, "You want coffee with that?" or "You want some coffee or what?" and not very pleasant, how likely is that customer to come back? Probably not very. In fact, if this is their only experience with that brand, they may never give another location a chance, right? So the social capital is the cultural heartbeat of the organization. Culture pulls people together and draws them to the organization as an employee or a customer. That's from Chris Snyder at the Exit Planning Institute. I like to say it a little differently. If you own a business, or if you're wanting to go into business and even you're thinking of starting a business, If you're not clear on your mission and vision, then you don't have a clear ability within yourself to communicate to potential employees and potential customers what you're all about. What you're likely going to produce is a generic thing of, we want to be, an esteemed provider of thus and such hardware to the greater Sacramento area, right? It doesn't say much. It just says, we want to provide these things. And someone says, okay, well, they want to do a good job. Wonderful. But let's say that personally, you've got a mission and a vision that isn't hardware. Hardware is simply a means to an end for you. It's intended to be a business that gives you the freedom of your time to not work for someone else's priorities, to work for your own. And maybe a really important part of your priority is investing your time in causes. Those causes could be environmental. Those causes could be related to kids. Those causes could be related to your faith. They could be related to anything. But ultimately, you're wanting your business to be a vehicle for that. And if you were to communicate that, what would happen? Well, people are, apply for, yeah, this is just a job, I'm just selling tools. If they come to work for you, and they can be a really great person that came to you with really great recommendations from somebody, and they have a really good track record with other employers. But maybe they're also a muscle car fanatic, right? And they're all about their 454 Chevy, 454 powered Chevelle, and they come to work and they want to do a great job for you, but all they're hearing about is converting to electric. Might turn them off. Doesn't mean that they're not going to work hard, but are they likely to be as engaged? Maybe not. They're not going to be as great of a hire for you as if they're not engaged, right? So if you're putting out there what you're about, you're going to have folks that won't come and apply for work with you, but those are going to be folks that don't relate to you anyway and wouldn't be as engaged, and very well might be disappointed when they come to work for you. But the people who do relate to your mission and vision will beat a path to your door. They're going to be more engaged employees. Now, those two people, are they better or worse than one another? No, not on the face of it. It's just one is more likely to be engaged. They're also going to be able to relate to your goals, objectives, and metrics that you want to reach. They're going to take personal ownership in those. And as we see, engaged employees are 30% more productive. That is quantifiable. So that's really having a clear, picture of your mission and vision so that you can create a culture and foster a culture within the organization that's healthy and engaging is critical to a long-term organization. So for you sellers, that's something to consider. If you notice a lot of tension in your organization, if you notice, I'm not getting into politics at all, but if within your business you see politics as it relates to the operation of the business, if you see, factions, if you see cliques, something's leading to that. And it typically is going to be because there's no overarching unifying mission and vision, if that makes sense, right? For those of you who are looking to buy a business, it's really important to be aware of whether that business has a mission and vision that aligns with the future that you want, right? Oversimplifying, if you're wanting to build muscle cars, it probably doesn't make sense to buy an EV manufacturing company, right? Because in order to change to build muscle cars that run an internal combustion engine, you're getting rid of everything that made it an electric car company, and you've got all the cost of converting it. I know that's a nonsensical comparison, but it makes very obvious what I'm talking about. And finally is the customer capital, and this is really the byproduct. Customer capital is really looking at how you compare to your peers as it relates to the size and frequency of customer engagements. Now, what do I mean by that? If I'm looking at real estate businesses and I'm comparing two businesses, I'm not going to compare a property management company to a real estate sales company. And why is that? Well, the person who sells a house is going to make a 6% commission. Now, of course, it gets divided amongst everybody, but generally you're looking at a 6% commission is generated by the sale of that home. Whereas property managers are getting pennies per month based on the rents that they charge for an individual. And let's face it, rent on a house is far less than a purchase price of a house, right? So those are not comparable. But on the flip side, the person who sells a house is immediately unemployed because they have to go find a new customer, right? Whereas the property manager gets recurring revenue on a predictable basis on a contract. So while they're not getting big fat commissions, they have the safety of recurring revenue. So they both have their, I don't want to say strengths and weaknesses, but they both have their revenue and cash flow characteristics. And so you're only going to compare property management companies to one another as a result, and you're only going to compare real estate brokerages to one another as a result. And buyers, you're going to want to look at those models and say, which, if either of those fit with what I'm comfortable from a risk and predictability standpoint. Am I okay with a bit of risk to drive higher returns? Or am I okay with $1 a day keeps the bill collector away, right? Something that's more predictable. So that's really important for you to understand about yourself as a buyer. But what a seller can do to improve each of these areas is can improve the confidence in a potential buyer and thereby being willing to pay more for that business, if that makes sense. Okay, so now that we've done that, we've gone through each of these 4 areas and looked at we haven't done it here, but we've gone through these 4 areas. We've addressed gaps with all the value drivers that we've analyzed. We've worked together and we've executed on the action items necessary to close those gaps. Then we need to evaluate, if you're a longer term planner, of what are the 3 gaps standing in your way of having the life you want after you sell. Well, one of them might be a wealth gap, because if you're relying on the sale of this business to fund your retirement, then you have to say, well, outside the business, do I have enough in income and assets to meet my long-term financial needs? If the answer is no, then the next question is, well, is the business worth enough that when I sell it, after I pay taxes and everything, is there enough in net proceeds to fill that gap? If the answer is no, then you're going to have to increase the value of the business in order to meet that, if that makes sense. Putting real dollars and cents on it, if you had a gap of $250,000 if you had a gap of $500,000, a wealth gap of $500,000, and if right now we were to sell your business and it would only give you $250,000, then we would need to double the value of your business, right? And if you said, well, Michael, the most time I'm willing to give this is 3 years, we would need to grow the value of your business at 24% a year for 3 years to achieve that. Is that possible? In many cases, yes, right? But again, every business is different. We have to look at the circumstances. So that's the wealth gap. The next thing is the profit gap. The gap of your profit performance subtracted from best in class profit performance. So that's really looking at, when we look at the 4 things from before, we're looking at, well, if you, let's say that you've got a business that has, and I'm just going to use some numbers that you're typically not going to see, but just to make the math easy. Let's say that you've got a business that generates $100,000 in profit. And it's on $1 million, right? That means you've got 10% net profit. Now, let's say that a typical business in your space has a 15% net margin. Well, that means on that same million in revenue, they're generating $150,000 in profit, right? So we look at, do we have opportunities in the business to close that profit gap? Because if we don't, then we don't have the leverage necessary to grow the value of the business, because growing it by growing sales isn't nearly as powerful as growing it by profits. Because if I can grow that business, if I can grow profitability from 10 to 15%, I just increased the value of the business by 50% just by improving operational efficiencies, right? The next is the value gap, the gap between your company's value and what it would be if it enjoyed best in class. So, rule of thumb, small businesses under $1 million in sales are typically, ones that are owner operated and not investor owned and manager operated, typically are going for between, call it 2 and 3 times, or 2.5 and 3.5 times. We call it profit, but it's seller's discretionary earnings. So, well, what's the difference between one that's at 2.5 and one that's at 3.5? Exactly, it's going to be those practices in your business as they compare to best in class. So if you're not documenting your policies and procedures, so your employee onboarding is horrible and your turnover is high. If you don't have a process for managing a manufacturing, how things are manufactured, and you've got a bunch of bottlenecks, and it's, I had this with one of my clients, huge bottlenecks in their business that just by the amount of time, dead time on the line, was a significant double-digit percentage that we were able to save just because they were just inefficient in their manufacturing practices, yet still paying full payroll, right? So when you're able to address those things, then that improves your profit. It also improves your multiple. So let's say that the person that's got a 10% multiple is going to be at 2 times. Well, 2 times $100,000 then becomes $200,000. So even though they had $1 million in sales, right? A 2x multiple times 100,000 in, call it profit, is $200,000. But now let's say that this person who had $150,000 in profit went for a 3x multiple. I'm not going to the 3.5 because I'm not going to do it in my head right now. So if we go for 150,000 at a 3x multiple, that's $450,000. So we just went from $200,000 multiple, right, to a $450,000 multiple. That's over 100%. That's 125% increase in value just by improving the profit margin and getting the better multiple because the business is better run, if that makes sense. So these are the 3 things that could stand in the way, but doing these 3 things and taking the time to do them can make an exponential difference in your financial success in exiting the business. We're not going to go through the exit planning stool right now. That's another conversation because we're just talking about buying and selling now, not planning. All right, so now we're down to two acronyms that you need to know. The first one you're going to hear about as you're thinking about valuing your business for sale, and if you're on Biz by Sale looking at them. You're going to notice a term called EBITDA, and that's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. In other words, when you do your tax return, it's your earnings, it's your bottom line earnings. What are your profits? But before you've deducted interest, taxes, appreciation, and amortization, because those things are just bookkeeping entries, right? So in other words, we're looking purely at the financial performance of the business without looking at, your interest and all that. It's just how did the business itself perform? And This metric is typically used on managed businesses, not owner operated. So they're a little bit larger business. It doesn't mean that they're Walmart. It doesn't even mean that they're a chain of 5 stores, right? It could still be a small business, but it's one that's large enough that maybe they've got a general manager and the owner's not having to be there every day, right? So that's literally what we're looking at. Now, seller's discretionary earnings is a little different. It's a financial metric to assess the true annual benefit to a single owner of a small business. It includes net income, owner's compensation, discretionary expenses, and non-recurring items. So I'll give you an example of this. I had an attorney client. Now, the attorney client paid himself handsomely. He had a really good firm. But he also had a child, an adult child, that, did stuff that a person that wasn't a family member would only probably be expected to make $15 an hour for. But because it's a family member, they're paying the son 70 grand a year. Right? That's a lot more than $15 an hour for those who are curious. So I'm sure that was obvious to everyone. Now, if I buy that business, I'm not going to pay anybody 70 grand a year to do a $15 an hour job. So what does that mean? Well, that means I get to keep that difference, right? So that's what you call an add back, and that add back is called it's above market family compensation, right? So that's an add back. Other things that are add backs might be, hey, we've got we're financing a truck. Well, that debt's going to be paid off when I buy the business, and I'm not going to buy another truck. I'm not going to finance anything. Whatever they're making on their payments, that's also an add back, right? So that really truly is what is the benefit that new owner would expect to receive. Just because the seller is choosing to pay for those things now, if the business keeps performing the same way, that's money that you as a buyer get to put right in your pocket. So that's the difference. The SDE is used for smaller businesses where it's an owner operator. They're not paying someone else to run the business. Literally everything that's left over after you've paid the bills and you get to keep for yourself, that's how that's kind of calculated. We're down to the last one, the one rule you need to know. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, there was a spoiler at the beginning. 80% of businesses listed for sale don't sell. They go out of business in the process, leaving the owner and employees without the financial security they're relying on, and a community without a trusted source of goods and services. I'm a strong believer in this. The best economic impact and the best economic action activities that we could conduct aren't getting people to start businesses. I'm all for it. But if you've got a business that also exists and functions and employs people and has already grown and has already proven itself, ensuring that business can survive another generation is awesome because everybody keeps their jobs. They're not on unemployment. The seller selling it at the time they actually need it the most, when it's time to retire, they don't have another do-over in them. They've got a means to retire with dignity from this thing that they built and that they sacrificed so much for. And to the person who's looking to buy the business, you're not gambling, right? You're not saying, I've got this idea, could be the greatest idea in the world, but if you don't have enough working capital to last until you have enough customers buying your product or service, you could be one of those 90% that go out of business. Instead, you say, hey, I'm going to go to the bank and get a loan. Here's the financial track record of this business. I know that it can afford to pay the debt and that I'm still going to be able to pay myself from day one. I think that, this is my soapbox, but if you're in an area, I think that unless you've got a product that doesn't exist, a service or that hasn't existed before, a service that hasn't existed before, so in other words, something that's completely new innovation, or you live in an area where an existing product or service isn't currently available, then you're better off buying an existing well-run, make this qualification, well-run business, right? Because you're mitigating the risk of starting from scratch. It's something that's already proven, already has customers, already has profits, already has a paycheck for you. You know, because let's face it, if you want to buy a machine shop, there's plenty of them that already have big books of business. You know, you don't need to go out and make the capital expenditures into buying equipment and all of that. You can get something that's a going concern, right? Now, if you came up with the new AI tool that didn't exist before, you know, if you've got a new way to skin a cat that didn't exist and requires a whole new process to do it, absolutely. But I would first and foremost find out if it's lower risk and if there is opportunity for you to acquire something that's already existing. And with that, I open up to any questions.
Of fascinating information. I know. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there with us. We really appreciate it. Uh, Lots to sift through there, Michael. We do have one question in the chat, and anybody else who's still with us, if you want to ask Michael questions, now's the time to do it. Go ahead and put them in the Q&A or the chat. We will get you either way. Okay, so this gentleman says, what is the value used to find the value of the business? I'm looking to buy a business, but think it might be overpriced.
So it depends on the industry and it depends on the size. So typically you're looking at, again, as I had mentioned, if it's an owner operator, of course there's exceptions. You know, we're talking bell curve, right? I mean, every business can be different, and it also varies by geography. I will make that case. You're typically looking at 2.5 to 3.5 times seller's discretionary earnings. And so if they're generating $100,000, then they could reasonably be looking at a price of $250 to $350, unless there are other things that it includes. I mean, there could be extenuating circumstances that are additional value. That would be kind of the enterprise value. You're just looking at a financial value. There may be some other assets and things that would change for that.
Great. Let's see. Another couple of questions here. Well, will the slide presentation be shared with attendees of the webinar?
With the corrected slide, with the corrected final slide.
So just so you know, what we will do is once I get this edited and get the timestamps in it, and Michael gives me the PowerPoint with the corrected slide, it'll go out on demand. It'll have links in there that'll be helpful for you. So thank you for asking that. Let's see, another question. And yes, I did put Michael's contact information in there. It's in the chat. Let me know if you don't see it, but I put it in there. Please feel free to contact Michael. He's got his email address and the website. So let's see, another question from Joshua. What do we need to do to get someone an independent valuation done, maybe by you, if that is what you do, Michael? And can we get a copy of the slides of the recording? Okay, yes, well, we covered that part.
So yeah, I'll give you, I'm going to give you a qualification. There's all different kinds of valuations. So the valuation that a banker is going to want to see is going to be an appraisal. If somebody is doing a divorce, or they're doing a buy-sell agreement, or something where there is there's a court-related issue or a tax-related issue, you're going to be looking at something above that. That's called a 409A. That's a little different. But for every day, if you're simply owning a business right now and you're thinking about, I need to have an idea of what it's worth. We can do what's called an operational value. And really what it is looking at what are your gaps. Like, for instance, Joshua, if it's your business, you can actually go to my website right now. And actually, all of you are welcome to do this. I mentioned in the 4 areas, there were a number of value drivers. I've got at the top of my website, this does not trigger any kind of series of selling emails or anything at this point. But if you go to the top, it'll say, is your biz leavable? You're going to click on that button. You're going to provide your name and email address. And it's going to take you through a series of about 25 questions that are rank scored. That's going to ask you from your perspective, right? This is your own gut check. It's going to ask you some things about your business. And it's, kind of from strongly disagree to strongly agree. There's point values assessed in there, and it's weighted based on, legal and HR has much more impact than, say, sales and marketing, right? Because if you don't have good sales and marketing planning, you just don't sell as much. If you've got bad legal and HR preparation, you could be put out of business overnight, right? So it's all kind of weighted. At the end, what it's going to tell you, it's going to give you a score, right? Again, this is at a high level. When people hire me to do the deep dive, we're 150 plus questions in there. But at this high level, you're able to get an idea based on how you feel, where you stand on things. And again, be brutally honest with yourself, because if you're not, the only person you're feeling is you. You're not helping anyone, because it helps you to identify where gaps are that make the most sense for you to focus on. I.e., don't build a swimming pool, update your master bath and your kitchen, these types of things. And it's going to create a report for you that shows you what value gaps you have, estimated, of course, and give you an idea. What that also tells you is, if you fix these things, what could you recoup? What could you recoup in the value of that business? So very useful for you if you're thinking about selling, to get an idea of where you stand currently. Another thing that's good and valuable for, and then I can also help with separately, is that we look at it from a financial valuation standpoint. If you're needing to get key person coverage, if you're needing to get an insurance policy for a buy-sell agreement, I'm not going to write the insurance, but it gives you a good idea of how much really does it make sense for me to get, because you're able to identify what the risk is, right? By having an idea of the value, identifying what could I stand to lose if a key person leaves or passes away and I don't have a replacement for them? How much insurance should I have, right? So all of those, and then also when you're thinking about going to market, I have a client. We had an appraiser. We didn't have to do it yet, but we did, because both the seller and the employee that were buying the business, they both followed this particular firm because they do more than just appraisals. They're actually advisors in that space. Now, I actually helped them get a 40, even though they're an appraiser, I helped them get a 40% higher value, because when I looked at the valuation that they did, they actually used the wrong method. They used EBITDA instead of SDE, and it resulted in a very discounted value. I had given her an estimate, a thumbnail investment or estimate, for her to get an idea if it was worth it for her to sell yet, and if it was something that the business would support a loan for. Those two things are really important, because it could be worth the amount that I said, but if there wasn't enough free cash flow to afford a loan at the current interest rates, and she doesn't have the wherewithal to finance all of it, then that would tell us right off the bat, it does not make sense to sell the business at this time. Let's wait until interest rates improve, right? So having that annual look at it, that kind of thumbnail idea, is something that we could do all the time without you going out and spending thousands of dollars on an appraisal.
That's great. By the way, Joshua loves the name of your business. So
thank you so much, Joshua. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions in here. You get a last chance here if you want to ask Michael any questions. Otherwise, you can email him.
And thank you for sticking around. I know this was longer than it was allotted. I thank you for everybody for your patience. I hope it was worth it. I hope that it was of value.
Most definitely. All right, well, that's a wrap this week. Kelly and I will be back next week for, I cannot believe it's going to be webinar Wednesday number 360. Can you believe that? Anyway, it's always a pleasure, Michael. Thanks everybody for staying with us, and I hope you have a great afternoon. So for Michael Balstad, I'm Maureen Busher-Dang, and for Kelly Bearden, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.